Why was a tiny pale hand sticking out of the ruins of a bombed Afghan compound, hours after the battle had already ended? Senior Chief Marcus Garrett almost walked past it. The dust was still floating in the air like ash after a funeral. Rubble covered everything: broken walls, shattered wood, fragments of lives that had existed only hours earlier. Garrett moved through the wreckage slowly, carefully, the way men do after decades of war. 23 years in the Navy had taught him that silence after an explosion could be more dangerous than the explosion itself. His boots crunched over broken concrete. Clear left. Clear right. His team moved methodically through the compound. Somewhere beyond the valley, Taliban fighters were regrouping. They had maybe 20 minutes before the place turned violent again. Then Garrett saw it. A hand. Small. Pale against the gray dust. It looked almost delicate. The fingers curled slightly as if reaching for something that had slipped away. "Hold," Garrett said quietly. The single word froze the entire team. He stepped closer and knelt beside the rubble. With careful hands, he brushed away chunks of stone and twisted metal. A sleeve appeared first, woodland camouflage shredded by shrapnel. Then an arm. Then a shoulder. "American," someone whispered behind him. More rubble moved aside. A young woman's face emerged from the debris, blonde hair tangled with dust and dried blood. Her skin looked gray under the early morning light. She couldn't have been more than 25. "Jesus," Petty Officer Hayes muttered. "She's just a kid." Garrett didn't answer. His hand moved automatically to her neck, two fingers pressing against the carotid artery. Standard procedure. Professional courtesy for the dead. But the moment his fingers touched her skin, something fluttered beneath them. Weak. Faint. Impossible. Garrett leaned closer. Then he said the words none of them expected. "She's alive." Hayes blinked at him. "Chief, she's got. I can see what she's got, litter now." Because Garrett could see the wounds. 7 entry holes. Chest. Shoulder. Legs. Blood soaked the uniform like spilled ink. No exit wounds visible. That meant the bullets were still inside her, grinding through muscle and bone with every fragile breath. She should have died hours ago. But somehow she hadn't. Garrett brushed dust away from the dog tags around her neck. The metal glinted under his weapon light. Reeves Sloan M. HM2, hospital corpsman. A medic. Someone whose entire job was saving lives. Garrett looked at her again. The small frame buried under rubble, the medical patch barely visible through blood. "Hang on, corpsman," he murmured. Far away, helicopter rotors began to thunder through the valley. But what Garrett didn't know, what none of them knew, was how this young medic had ended up buried under a collapsed building in the first place. And what she had done before the bullets found her. 72 hours earlier, Sloan Reeves sat inside a roaring C-130 cargo plane, gripping the straps of a medical kit that weighed nearly half her body weight. 43 Marines and sailors filled the cargo bay. Some slept, some checked weapons, most just stared into space, faces hardened by too many deployments. Across from Sloan, a Marine studied her with open skepticism. "You the new doc?" She nodded. "You look 12. 24, she replied calmly. The Marine leaned forward slightly. "You ever see combat, doc?" Sloan didn't answer right away. She had. Ramadi. Sangin. Marja. Places where the ground remembered blood. But none of those places had prepared her for the question that lived quietly in the back of her mind. What happens when a medic has to pick up a weapon? Because Sloan had made a promise once. A promise beside a grave in Kansas. Her father had been a Marine sniper. Master Gunnery Sergeant Colt Reeves. a legend among shooters, a man who could read wind like poetry and send a bullet across impossible distances. He taught Sloane to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle. But cancer took him before she turned 18. And at his funeral, with rifles cracking the sky and her mother crying beside her, Sloane had sworn something she believed with her whole heart. "I will never pick up a weapon in war." She would save lives, not take them. So she enlisted as a hospital corpsman. For 6 years she kept that promise. Through blood, through screams, through the endless work of stitching broken soldiers back together. She carried gauze instead of bullets, morphine instead of magazines. She healed, always healed. But as the C-130 descended toward Afghanistan that night, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered a question she tried not to hear. What if saving lives someday required something more? Hours later, Sloane moved silently through the Afghan night with Marine Recon Team Havoc. The desert was black and silent. Their mission was simple: extract an informant from a Taliban compound and disappear before sunrise. Sloane stayed in the rear, exactly where the team leader told her. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to fix what fighting broke. The assault began with flashbangs. Doors exploded inward. Rifles cracked through the darkness. 2 minutes later, the informant was secured. No casualties. Clean mission. Perfect. For a moment, Sloane allowed herself to breathe. Then the secondary explosion shattered everything. The blast threw her to the ground. Dust filled the air. Over the radio, someone screamed. Down man, Structure 3 collapsed. 2 Marines were trapped inside the rubble. Sloane didn't wait for orders. She ran straight into the wreckage. Inside the collapsed building she found them. Corporal Miller, Lance Corporal Jennings. One had a femoral artery severed. The other had a collapsed lung. Both were dying. Sloane dropped her kit and went to work. Tourniquet, needle decompression, IV line. Her hands moved fast, steady, calm. Outside, gunfire started again. Taliban reinforcements. Extraction delayed. And suddenly Sloane realized something terrifying. They would have to hold this position for hours. Just her, 2 dying Marines, and a growing army of enemies closing in. Miller looked past her, at the rifle leaning against the rubble beside him. His sniper rifle. "Doc," he whispered weakly. She turned. The weapon rested against the wall like a silent question. Cold steel. Perfectly balanced. Familiar. Too familiar. Her father's voice echoed in memory. "Breathe slow, let your heartbeat settle, then take the shot." Sloane felt her hands start to tremble. "I can't," she whispered. "Because promises matter. Because vows made over graves are heavy things." But outside, boots crunched closer. Voices shouted in Pashto. Jennings gasped for breath. "Please, Doc." In that moment, Sloane understood something painful. Sometimes life doesn't give you choices that feel clean. Sometimes saving someone means crossing a line you swore you never would. Slowly, reluctantly, her hand reached for the rifle. The weight settled against her shoulder like an old memory. She pressed her eye to the scope. And far away on a rooftop, a Taliban sniper raised his weapon toward the building. Sloane inhaled, exhaled. The crosshairs steadied. For 6 years she had healed. For 6 years she had refused the other skill her father gave her. But now 2 wounded Marines were breathing because of her. And they would stop breathing unless she acted. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked. And in that moment, the promise she had carried for years shattered like glass in the dark. because sometimes mercy wears two faces. One hand heals, the other protects. And Sloane Reeves was about to learn that the hardest battles aren't fought against enemies. They're fought inside the quiet spaces of your own heart. Why was the sniper aiming at her? And why did her hands suddenly stop shaking the moment she touched the rifle? Sloane didn't think about the promise anymore. Not in that moment. Because the scope had already swallowed the world. The broken compound disappeared. The dust vanished. Even the gunfire faded into a distant roar. All that remained was the small green circle of glass and the man inside it. The Taliban sniper was still settling into position on the rooftop 200 meters away. Calm, methodical, professional. The kind of man who had done this before. His rifle barrel angled slowly toward the shattered building where Sloane and the wounded Marines lay. Toward Miller. Toward Jennings. Toward her. Sloane's heart was racing, fast, uneven. Her father would have scolded her for that. Your heartbeat is the enemy of accuracy, Scout. Slow it down. She forced herself to inhale slowly. The air tasted like dust and burnt gunpowder. Then she exhaled. Her pulse began to settle. 120 beats. The crosshair steadied. For a moment she hesitated. Because inside her head, the promise whispered again. You swore you would never do this. But then Miller groaned behind her. A wet, ragged sound. She didn't need to turn to know what that meant. Hemorrhagic shock. His body was running out of blood. Running out of time. And suddenly the choice felt brutally simple. Either she kept her promise, or two young Marines died. Sloane adjusted the scope. Wind from the east. 10 miles per hour. Distance roughly 600 yards. Her father's voice moved through memory like quiet instruction. Don't fight the wind, understand it. She exhaled again. The crosshair settled on the sniper's chest. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered. The recoil punched her shoulder. Through the scope she watched the bullet streak toward the rooftop. And miss. 4 inches left. The sniper didn't even flinch. He simply shifted slightly, adjusting his aim toward the muzzle flash. Toward her. Sloane worked the bolt automatically. The sound was mechanical, smooth, familiar. She adjusted again. The wind had been stronger than she guessed. 12 miles per hour now. Quartering from the southeast. Her father's voice again. Don't rush the second shot. The rifle is patient. She breathed. The world shrank into that tiny green circle. Then she fired. This time the bullet struck center mass. The sniper jerked once. Then his body toppled backward off the roof and disappeared. For a moment Sloane forgot how to breathe. She had just killed a man. For 6 years she had refused to do exactly that. Her hands trembled. Her stomach twisted. But there was no time to think about it. Because outside the building, shouting erupted. 4 Taliban fighters had seen the sniper fall. They were already running toward the compound. Sloane pulled the bolt again. Her training moved faster than her emotions. First target. 30 yards. Running hard across broken ground. She fired. The man dropped instantly. Second target. Another shot. Another body hitting the dirt. The remaining 2 fighters dove behind a ruined wall. Smart. They understood now that someone inside was shooting back. That hesitation bought Sloane something priceless. Time. She set the rifle down and turned back to her patients. Miller's face had gone pale. His eyes fluttered open weakly. Doc, he whispered. I'm here. You shooting out there. Not important right now. She squeezed another bag of saline into his IV line. His pulse felt like a thin thread under her fingers. Jennings coughed violently beside them. The decompression needle in his chest had started to fail again. Air was building inside his lung. She needed to fix it. Now, Sloane reached for another needle. And that's when she heard movement above her. A faint scraping sound. On the broken roof. Her body reacted before her mind did. She grabbed the rifle and rolled onto her back, aiming upward. A figure dropped through the hole in the ceiling. Her finger tightened. Then she saw the American flag patch. Gunnery Sergeant Clayton, Flint, Morrison landed in a crouch, rifle sweeping the room. He spotted Sloane instantly. Spotted the rifle in her hands. And the two wounded Marines behind her. "Sitrep," he said calmly. "Miller first," Sloane replied quickly. Femoral artery severed, tourniquet holding, severe blood loss. Jennings next. Tension pneumothorax, decompressed once, might need another. Morrison nodded. Then he glanced at the rifle again. "You dropped the rooftop sniper." Sloane hesitated. "Yes." "How far?" 680. "In the dark. With wind." Morrison studied her for a long moment. Not disbelief. Recognition. "Who taught you to shoot like that?" "My father." "Name?" "Master Gunnery Sergeant Colt Reeves." Morrison's expression changed slightly. He leaned back a little. "Beirut Reeves." Sloane nodded once. The sniper who'd stopped an RPG team at 1,200 yards. The sniper who'd saved hundreds of Marines. Morrison exhaled quietly. I wondered why the name sounded familiar. He keyed his radio. "Havoc 1, this is Havoc 3. I'm with Doc and casualties." Static crackled. Blackwood's voice answered. "Status." Morrison glanced at Sloane again. "Doc's the real deal, gunner, marksmanship included." There was a pause on the radio. Then Blackwood said carefully, "Say again." She neutralized a sniper at 600+ yards. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Blackwood replied. "Understood." But before anyone could say anything else, gunfire erupted outside again. A bullet punched through the wall inches from Sloane's head. Concrete dust exploded across her face. She didn't flinch. Her hands kept working on Jennings' chest. That was the strange thing about combat medicine. You learned to ignore death when it was close enough to breathe on you. Morrison crouched beside the wall. "Doc," he shouted over the gunfire. "We've got a problem." She looked up. He pointed toward the eastern side of the compound. Through the broken wall, she could see distant muzzle flashes. Lots of them. Elevated position. Machine gun team. 800 yards, Morrison said. "They're suppressing our guys every time they try to move." "Can anyone reach them?" "Not from here." He looked straight at her. "But someone on the north wall might." Sloane shook her head immediately. "No. Doc, I've got 2 dying Marines." "And if that machine gun keeps firing," Morrison replied quietly, "you'll have 10 more." Silence fell between them. The gunfire outside intensified. Sloane looked at Miller. His eyes were closed now. Barely breathing. She'd done everything she could for him. Everything except. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then stood. "I'll take the shot." Morrison led her to a gap in the north wall. The opening was narrow. Barely wide enough for one person to lie prone. But it gave a clear line of sight toward the hill where the machine gun team had set up. Through the scope Sloane saw them. 2 men. One firing. one feeding ammunition. Professional. Disciplined. Wind stronger now. 12, maybe 13 miles per hour. Distance roughly 800 yards. Uphill shot. She adjusted the scope carefully. Elevation. Windage. Her breathing slowed again. Behind her, Morrison watched silently. Finally, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. 2 seconds passed. Then the gunner jerked violently and collapsed. The second fighter looked around in confusion. Sloan worked the bolt. Fired again. The second man dropped. The machine gun went silent. For a moment, Morrison simply stared at her. Then he let out a quiet breath. Jesus Christ, Doc. Sloan lowered the rifle slowly. Her hands were shaking again now. The adrenaline was fading. Reality creeping back in. I need to get back to my patients, she said softly. Because 3 men were dead now. 3 men she had killed. And even if those deaths had saved lives, they still weighed something. She returned to Miller and Jennings. Their breathing was still there. Still fragile. Still fighting. Outside the compound, the Taliban began regrouping. More fighters were arriving. More gunfire echoed through the valley. And somewhere above the chaos, Sloan realized something terrifying. This battle wasn't over. Not even close. Because the enemy had just realized something too. Someone inside that building was a very dangerous woman. The valley grew quieter for a moment. Not silent, war never allowed silence, but quieter in the way a storm sometimes pauses before the next violent surge. Inside the shattered compound, dust drifted through broken sunlight like slow snow. Sloan pressed 2 fingers against Miller's neck again. The pulse was still there. Weak. Thready. But alive. Stay with me, she murmured. His eyelids fluttered faintly. Across the room, Jennings was breathing in short, shallow bursts. Each inhale sounded like it had to claw its way into his chest. Sloan wiped sweat and dust from her forehead with the back of her sleeve. Her hands were streaked with dried blood now, Miller's mostly. For a second, she just stared at them. 3 men dead. Her father's rifle still warm beside her. The promise she had carried for 6 years was lying in pieces on the concrete floor. But before her mind could spiral into that thought, Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's voice cut in sharply. Movement. He was still crouched at the north wall, rifle braced against the broken stone. Sloan looked up. What kind of movement? Drug. How many? He leaned slightly to adjust his angle. Looks like a technical. Her stomach tightened. A technical meant a pickup truck with a mounted heavy weapon. Usually a DSHK. Sometimes a recoilless rifle. Either one would tear the compound apart. How far? Sloan asked. About a click out, Morrison said. Coming fast. He tapped his radio again. Havoc 1, this is 3. Enemy technical approaching from East Ridge. Static. Then Blackwood's voice. How long? 2 minutes, maybe less. Any anti-armor in your position? Morrison glanced around the room. The answer was obvious. No. Another pause on the radio. Then Blackwood said the thing no one wanted to hear. Delay them if you can. The transmission cut. Sloan swallowed. Delay them. With 1 rifle. And 2 wounded Marines. Morrison looked at her again. You ever shoot a driver out of a moving vehicle? Sloan exhaled slowly. No. He nodded once. Today's full of firsts. Outside the compound, the low growl of an engine was growing louder. The technical burst over the ridge a few seconds later. Old Toyota pickup. sand-colored, dust trailing behind it like a comet tail. In the truck bed, a Taliban fighter gripped the handles of a mounted heavy machine gun. The barrel swung left and right as the vehicle bounced across the uneven ground. If he started firing, the compound walls wouldn't hold. Morrison slid aside from the firing position. He didn't say anything. He just gestured. "You're shot." Sloane lay prone behind the rifle again. Her cheek settled against the stock. Through the scope she saw the truck bouncing toward them. Distance 900 yards. Closing fast. Wind gusting across the valley. Driver visible through the windshield. Her father's voice whispered in memory. "Moving target. Lead the shot. Trust the math." Her heart hammered again. Because this wasn't a still rooftop sniper anymore. This was a speeding vehicle. One shot might be all she got. Behind her, Miller groaned faintly. The sound sharpened her focus instantly. Sloane adjusted the scope. Breathing slow. Wind right to left. Truck moving roughly 40 miles per hour. She placed the crosshair ahead of the windshield. Waited. Timed the bounce of the suspension. Then squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered. The truck kept moving. For half a second Sloane thought she had missed. Then the windshield exploded inward. The driver's body slumped sideways. The truck veered violently. The gunner tried to grab the wheel. Too late. The technical slammed into a rocky ditch and flipped onto its side. The mounted machine gun fired wildly as it struck the ground, spraying rounds harmlessly into the sky. Then everything went still. Dust rolled across the valley. Inside the compound, Morrison let out a slow whistle. "I'm officially done doubting you, Doc." But Sloane wasn't celebrating. Because through the scope she saw something else. More figures on the ridge. Not 4. Not 6. Dozens. Taliban fighters spreading across the high ground. Reinforcements. Her stomach dropped. "Morrison." "Yeah. There are a lot more coming." He stepped beside her and looked through the scope. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he muttered quietly. "Company-sized element. How many is that?" "Too many." His radio crackled again. "Havoc 3 report." Morrison pressed the transmit button. "Enemy reinforcements on ridge line. Estimate 30 plus." Static filled the channel. Then Blackwood's voice returned, tense now. "We're pinned on the south side. Can't break through." Another Marine voice shouted something in the background. Gunfire rattled through the radio. Blackwood came back on. "Doc status." Morrison glanced back at Sloane's patience. "Still breathing." "Then we hold." The transmission cut again. "Hold." Sloane felt a strange calm settle over her. The kind that only appeared when fear had nowhere left to go. She checked Miller's pulse again. Still there. Still fragile. Jennings was conscious now, barely. His eyes focused weakly on her. "Doc, I'm here. You shooting earlier." She gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah." "Good," he whispered. "Because those guys out there, they suck." Despite everything, Sloane laughed quietly. Then Morrison spoke again. "Doc." She looked up. "Yeah. You realize something, right?" "What?" He nodded toward the rifle. "You're the only reason any of us are still alive." Sloane didn't answer. Because outside the compound, the enemy line had started moving again. 30 fighters advancing downhill. Closing the distance. And the rifle beside her only held 5 rounds. Morrison checked his magazine. Half empty. Not nearly enough. The valley wind howled across the broken buildings, carrying the sound of approaching footsteps. And Sloane understood something with cold clarity. She had broken her promise once today. Before this battle ended, she might have to break it many more times. The enemy line moved slowly down the ridge. 30 fighters, maybe more, spread out in a loose formation across the rocky slope. They weren't rushing anymore. That meant they had learned something. Someone inside the compound could shoot, and shoot very well. Sloane watched them through the scope, tracking their movement carefully. Distance, just over 700 yards. Closing. The rifle beside her suddenly felt very small. 5 rounds in the magazine. 3 spare clips in Morrison's vest. 20 rounds total. Against 30 men. Morrison crouched next to the wall, scanning the valley through his optic. "They're being cautious," he muttered. "That's good, right?" Sloane asked. For about 5 minutes. He pulled another magazine from his vest and checked it. "After that they'll realize we're low on ammo." He glanced back toward Miller and Jennings. "We can't let them get close." Sloane nodded. She knew exactly what close meant. Within grenade distance. Within rifle distance. Within killing distance. Her father's rifle rested calmly in her hands. The same rifle she had sworn never to use again. But today had already destroyed that promise. The radio crackled again. Blackwood's voice was strained. "Havoc 3, report enemy distance." Morrison checked through the scope again. 600 and closing. Static hissed. Then Blackwood replied quietly. "Air support is 20 minutes out." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Copy." He released the transmit button slowly. 20 minutes. Sloane didn't need military experience to understand that number. 20 minutes was forever in a firefight. Outside the compound, the Taliban fighters continued their slow descent. 550 yards now. Some crouching behind rocks. Some advancing in short bursts. Professional enough. Disciplined enough. They knew how to fight. Sloane steadied the rifle again. "Who do I shoot first?" she asked. Morrison didn't hesitate. "Leaders." "How do you know who they are?" "Watch the others." He pointed through the scope. "See the guy giving hand signals." Sloane adjusted the magnification. She saw him instantly. Tall. Black vest. Directing 2 fighters to spread wider along the ridge. "Got him," she said. "Take the shot." Her breathing slowed again. Wind slightly stronger now. Right to left. Distance 500 yards. She adjusted. Squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked across the valley. Through the scope she watched the leader collapse instantly. The fighters around him froze. Confusion spreading. "Nice," Morrison said quietly. But the hesitation only lasted seconds. Another man stepped forward and started shouting orders. Sloane worked the bolt again. "Second leader," Morrison said. She fired. The man dropped mid-sentence. Now the enemy line truly stalled. Some fighters dropped prone. Others scrambled behind rocks. The momentum had shattered. Morrison nodded approvingly. Leadership kills slow armies down. Sloane didn't reply. She was already scanning for the next target. 300 yards now. A group of fighters were trying to flank toward the west wall. "If they reach that building," Morrison said, "they'll have cover. Then they won't reach it." She fired again. 1 fighter spun and fell. Another dove for cover. But the rest kept moving. Determined now. Angry. Bullets started snapping past the compound walls. Return fire. The first round punched through a cracked window above Sloane's head. The second shattered a chunk of concrete near Morrison's shoulder. He ducked lower. "They've spotted us." More gunfire erupted across the valley. Sloane chambered another round. 3 left. Her heart beat harder now. Not fear. Math. 30 fighters. 3 bullets. Morrison seemed to read her thoughts. "Make them count." She aimed again. Another fighter collapsed. 2 rounds left. Outside the compound, the enemy fire intensified. Bullets slammed into the walls like hail. Chunks of stone exploded into the air. Jennings coughed violently behind her. Sloane turned quickly. His chest tube had slipped loose. Air was building again in his lung. She crawled back to him immediately. Morrison grabbed her arm. "Doc, if I don't fix this," she snapped, "he dies." He released her instantly. 30 seconds. She worked fast. Gloves slick with blood. Needle. Tube. Tape. Jennings gasped as the pressure released from his chest. His breathing eased slightly. "Better," she whispered. Then she grabbed the rifle again and crawled back to the wall. The enemy was now inside 200 yards. Much closer. Much more dangerous. And that's when Morrison saw something new. "Doc." His voice was different this time. Not tense. Not calm. Just serious. She looked up. "What?" He pointed toward the ridge. Sloane looked through the scope again. And her stomach dropped. Because 3 fighters were dragging something heavy up the hillside. A long metal tube. Mounted on a tripod. Morrison said the word quietly. "Mortar." Sloane felt cold all over. If that mortar fired even one accurate round, the compound would become a crater. And Miller and Jennings wouldn't stand a chance. "How long?" she asked. "Maybe 60 seconds. She checked the rifle. 1 round left. The wind gusted across the valley again. The mortar crew was setting up fast. Professional. Efficient. Morrison looked at her. "No pressure, Doc." She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she took a slow breath. The crosshair settled over the mortar gunner. Distance 420 yards. Wind brutal. Hands steady. Heart slowing. Her father's voice echoed in memory one last time. The last shot always matters most. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle thundered. And the entire battle hung on what that bullet would do next. The rifle cracked across the valley. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Even the wind. Sloane stayed perfectly still behind the scope. Watching. Waiting. The mortar gunner jerked violently as the bullet struck him in the chest. His body slammed backward off the tripod and rolled down the rocky slope. The mortar tube tilted sideways and clanged against the ground. The second fighter reached for it instinctively. Morrison didn't wait. His rifle barked twice. The man dropped beside the mortar. The third fighter panicked and dove behind a rock. For a few precious seconds, the mortar threat vanished. Morrison exhaled slowly. "Good shooting, Doc." Sloane pulled back from the rifle. Her hands trembled again. The magazine was empty. No rounds left. She reached for another clip and began reloading with careful fingers. Outside the compound, the Taliban fighters were shouting now. Angry. Frustrated. Their advance had stalled again. But they were still coming. And there were still far too many of them. Morrison scanned the ridge through his optic. "They're splitting into teams." Sloane finished loading the rifle. "What does that mean?" They're done walking into our line of fire. He pointed toward the west side. Flanking movement. Sloan followed his gaze. Several fighters were already slipping between rocks and broken walls. Using cover. Getting closer. 200 yards. Soon they would reach grenade range. The radio crackled again. Havoc 3 report. Morrison grabbed the handset. Mortar neutralized. Enemy continuing advance. Static hissed. Then Blackwood's voice returned, tight with tension. We're trying to break through from the south. Gunfire rattled loudly behind his transmission. Another Marine shouted something unintelligible. Blackwood came back on. How long can you hold? Morrison glanced around the shattered compound. At Sloan. At the wounded Marines. Then back toward the advancing fighters. Not long. Another pause. Then Blackwood spoke again. Air support is 12 minutes out. 12 minutes. Still an eternity. The radio went silent again. Morrison lowered the handset. All right, he muttered. New plan. Sloan looked at him. What plan? We make them think there are more of us. How? He gave a small grim smile. Noise. He pulled a handful of magazines from his vest and slid them across the floor. Start firing from different positions. Won't that waste ammo? Maybe. He looked toward the approaching fighters again. But confusion buys time. Sloan understood immediately. She grabbed the rifle and moved to another broken window on the opposite wall. Different angle. Different silhouette. Through the scope she found another advancing fighter. Distance 180 yards. She fired. The man dropped. Then she rolled to a second opening. Fired again. Another fighter dove for cover. From the north wall, Morrison opened up with short controlled bursts. Bullets cracked across the valley from multiple directions now. To the Taliban fighters outside, it sounded like several defenders instead of two. Their advance slowed again. Some crouched behind rocks. Others fired blindly toward the compound. Bullets smashed through broken windows. Stone fragments rained across the room. One round slammed into the wall inches from Sloane's head. She didn't stop. She fired again. Another enemy fighter collapsed. But the enemy was adapting. They were spreading wider now, trying to surround the compound completely. Morrison ducked behind cover as rounds slammed into the north wall. They're figuring it out, he shouted. Sloan chambered another round. How long now? He checked his watch. 10 minutes. It still felt impossible. The fighters outside were now within 120 yards. Some had reached the outer rubble piles. Too close. Way too close. And then something unexpected happened. The radio crackled again. But this time the voice was Blackwood's. It was another Marine. Urgent. Excited. Havoc 3, this is Havoc 2. Morrison grabbed the handset. Go. We broke through the southern line. Gunfire roared behind the transmission. We're pushing toward your position now. Morrison's face brightened for the first time all day. ETA. 3 minutes. Sloan felt a surge of relief rush through her chest. 3 minutes was survivable. Maybe. But the Taliban fighters seemed to realize it too. Their attacks suddenly intensified. Shouting echoed across the valley. More fighters rushed forward at once. Not cautious anymore. Desperate. Bullets poured into the compound walls. One fighter sprinted toward the west entrance. Morrison leaned out and dropped him with a burst. Another appeared seconds later. Sloan fired. He fell just yards from the doorway. Dust and gunfire filled the air. Jennings shouted weakly from the floor. "Doc!" Sloan turned. His breathing was worsening again. Blood bubbled at the edge of his chest tube. She crawled back toward him immediately. "Stay with me," she said firmly. Behind her, Morrison kept firing. 2 minutes. Maybe less. The sounds of battle outside grew even louder. Closer. Different rifles now. American rifles. Then Sloan heard it. The deep thumping roar of heavy machine guns. Not Taliban weapons. Marine weapons. M240s. And suddenly, the ridge erupted with chaos. Taliban fighters began dropping everywhere. Caught in a devastating crossfire. Morrison looked through the window and grinned. Cavalry here. Outside the compound, a squad of Marines stormed over the ridge line. Rifles blazing. Grenades exploding. The remaining Taliban fighters broke and scattered in every direction. Some ran. Some fell. Within seconds, the attack collapsed completely. The valley slowly grew quiet again. Inside the compound, Sloan sat back on the floor. Her entire body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Morrison keyed the radio one more time. Havoc 1 compound secure. A moment later, boots pounded through the doorway as Marines rushed inside. Weapons ready. One of them stopped abruptly when he saw Sloan kneeling beside the wounded. A rifle still in her hands. Blood covering her sleeves. The Marine blinked. "A gunny." Morrison chuckled quietly. "Yeah." The Marine pointed at Sloan. "Is that the medic?" Morrison nodded. "Yep." The Marine stared at her in disbelief. "The medic did all this." Morrison glanced at Sloan again. Then he shrugged. "Let's just say she had a busy afternoon." Sloan barely heard them. She was already focused on Miller again. Checking his pulse. Still alive. Still fighting. And now, finally, help had arrived. But what Sloan didn't realize yet was this. By the end of that day, the story of the combat medic who fought like a sniper would spread through the entire battalion. And soon, much further than that, the compound smelled like gunpowder, blood, and dust. For a few seconds after the Marines stormed inside, the room was nothing but movement. Boots pounding. Rifles sweeping corners. Voices shouting. "Clear. Clear left. Roof hole secure." Then the chaos slowed as the reality inside the room became clear. 2 wounded Marines. A combat medic kneeling between them. And a sniper rifle resting beside her. A tall Marine sergeant pushed his way forward. He took one look at Miller and immediately knelt beside Sloan. "Status." "Femoral artery hit," Sloan said quickly. "Tourniquet's holding, but he needs surgery soon." The sergeant nodded and turned to another Marine. "Call for medevac." Then he glanced at Jennings. "Collapsed lung. Twice. Damn." He looked back at Sloan. "You kept them alive through all that." She shrugged faintly. "I tried." Across the room, Gunnery Sergeant Morrison leaned against the broken wall, finally allowing himself to relax a little. Blackwood entered the compound a moment later. His uniform was covered in dust and sweat. His rifle hung loosely in his hands. The moment he stepped inside, the other Marines instinctively made space. He scanned the room quickly. Then his eyes landed on Sloan. On the rifle beside her. On the spent casings scattered across the floor. He walked over slowly. "Doc." Sloan looked up. "Yes, Gunner." He nodded toward the rifle. "That yours?" "No." Then whose? My father. Blackwood crouched slightly and examined the weapon. Old but meticulously maintained. A custom bolt-action rifle. The kind of weapon only a master marksman would keep. Who's your father? He asked. Sloane hesitated, but Morrison answered from across the room. Master Gunnery Sergeant Colt Reeves. Blackwood looked up sharply. For a moment his expression shifted. Recognition. Beirut Reeves. Sloane nodded quietly. The room went silent for a second, because every Marine in that battalion knew that name. Years ago, during a brutal urban battle in Beirut, one sniper had eliminated an entire RPG team moments before they could destroy a Marine convoy. Hundreds of lives saved by a handful of perfectly placed shots. That sniper had been Colt Reeves. Blackwood stood slowly. Well, he said, that explains a lot. Outside the compound, the sound of helicopter blades suddenly rolled across the valley. Deep, heavy, growing louder. One of the Marines grinned. Medevac inbound. The thumping roar grew until dust swirled across the compound floor. A U-60 Black Hawk swept low over the valley and settled near the compound. Two medics sprinted inside with stretchers. Sloane immediately shifted back into full medical mode. All right, she said firmly, we move Miller first. The medics worked quickly beside her. IV bags lifted. Tourniquet checked. Stretcher secured. As they carried Miller outside, Sloane followed closely, still monitoring his pulse. The helicopter rotor wash blasted her hair across her face. They loaded Miller into the cabin. Jennings came seconds later. Still conscious. Still breathing. Barely. One of the flight medics looked at Sloane. You coming with them? She shook her head. I'll catch the next bird. The medic nodded and slammed the door. Moments later, the Black Hawk lifted off, climbing rapidly into the sky. Sloane watched it disappear beyond the mountains. Only then did she feel the exhaustion hit. It came like a wave. Her legs trembled slightly. Her shoulders ached. Her hands were still streaked with dried blood. Morrison walked over and handed her a canteen. Drink. She did. The water tasted like heaven. Blackwood approached again. You saved 2 Marines today, he said simply. Sloane looked down. I also killed several people. Blackwood didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out toward the ridge where the fight had taken place. Bodies scattered among the rocks. Then he said quietly, War forces choices. Sloane didn't answer, because she was still hearing the echo of the rifle in her mind. Still feeling the moment each trigger broke. Still seeing the figures drop through the scope. Blackwood continued studying her for a moment. Then he spoke again. How long has it been since you last fired that rifle? 6 years. Why stop? Sloane hesitated. Her father's face appeared in memory. The funeral. The folded flag. I promised someone I wouldn't do it anymore. Blackwood nodded slowly. Promises have weight. Yes. He looked toward the empty sky where the helicopter had vanished. But today that promise saved lives. Sloane didn't reply, because she still wasn't sure how to feel about that. Across the compound, the Marines had started collecting weapons and securing the area. The battle was over, but its aftermath lingered in every direction. Morrison walked over again. You know what's going to happen now, right? Sloane frowned slightly. What? The story. What story? He gestured toward the valley. 30 fighters held off by a combat medic with a sniper rifle. She groaned softly. Please don't. Too late. He nodded toward the Marines nearby. They've already started telling it. Sure enough, a group of younger Marines were whispering excitedly. Glancing toward Sloane, toward the rifle, Blackwood allowed himself a faint smile. "You may not like it," he said, "but the battalion's going to remember today." Sloane looked down at the rifle again. Her father's rifle. The promise she had broken. The lives it had saved. And the lives it had taken. She gently picked it up and slung it over her shoulder. The metal still felt warm. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains. Another storm was coming. And Sloane had a feeling this story was only just beginning.